gravel road into Hensley Farm is the kind that rattles your teeth if you drive it too fast, lined on both sides by split-rail fencing gone silver with age. It's early autumn, and the light comes in low and gold across 400 acres that have belonged to the same family since 1961. This is where you'll find Emma Hensley, 10 years old, standing at the kitchen counter with a mixing bowl full of broken eggshells. She's not baking anything. She's saving them. For the past 8 months, Emma has collected every single eggshell that's come out of her grandmother's kitchen, from the breakfast eggs, the Sunday morning pancakes, the birthday cakes. She rinses them, lets them dry on a wire rack by the window, and crushes them by hand into a coffee can she keeps on the back porch. Her grandfather, Walt, who has farmed this land for over 50 years, first noticed what she was doing back in February. He assumed it was one of those phases kids go through. Like the summer, she tried to catalog every type of cloud, or the winter, she insisted on naming all 31 laying hens after founding fathers. But this one didn't fade. If anything, it grew. By March, Emma had recruited her younger cousins to save shells from their own kitchens whenever they visited. By June, she'd convinced the local diner in town, the one her grandmother has waitressed at for going on 20 years, to set aside their shells in a 5-gallon bucket instead of tossing them in the dumpster. When Walt finally asked her what all this was for, Emma had an answer ready. "The soil's tired, Grandpa. I read that eggshells can help." She wasn't wrong, and what happened over the following growing season would turn into something the whole county still talks about. To understand why a 10-year-old's eggshell obsession mattered, you have to understand what was actually happening underneath the Hensley farm's soil. For 3 generations, the Hensley land had grown corn and soybeans in rotation, the standard practice across much of the Midwest. It's efficient, it's profitable, but it also steadily pulls calcium out of the ground. Calcium is one of those nutrients people don't talk about as much as nitrogen or phosphorus, but it does something critical. It's the mineral that holds soil structure together at a microscopic level. Without enough calcium, clay particles in soil lose their ability to bind properly. The ground becomes compacted, water runs off instead of soaking in. Roots struggle to push through, and a soil test Walt had run the previous fall confirmed what he'd suspected. The north 40 acres, the oldest cultivated section on the property, had calcium levels well below what the extension office recommended. He'd been planning to buy agricultural lime, crushed limestone, to correct it, the way farmers have for over a century. It's not expensive, but it's not free either. And on a year when soybean prices had already disappointed, it was one more cost on a long list. Emma had overheard this conversation between her grandfather and her father, Mark, who runs the row crop side of the operation. And a few weeks later, at the school library, she'd found something in a gardening book that changed the direction of her spring. Eggshells are roughly 95% calcium carbonate, chemically almost identical to the limestone farmers spread on their fields. The other 5% is mostly organic matrix protein and a small amount of other minerals like magnesium and phosphorus. When crushed fine enough and worked into soil, eggshells break down slowly and release that calcium carbonate, raising soil pH in acidic ground and improving structure over time. It's the same basic chemistry as agricultural lime, just packaged inside something most people scrape into the trash can every morning. Emma didn't fully understand the chemistry when she started. She just understood the arithmetic her grandfather had done out loud at the dinner table, and she understood that her family threw away eggshells every single day. "If it's basically the same thing as what you're going to buy," she told her grandfather, "why are we buying it?" By the time harvest came around, Emma had roughly 40 pounds of dried, crushed eggshell stored in feed sacks in the machine shed. It wasn't going to replace the lime application Walt eventually put down on the full 40 acres. 40 pounds of shell dust is a drop in the bucket compared to what several acres of depleted soil actually needs, and Walt was honest with her about that from the start. But he didn't dismiss it either. Instead, the two of them worked out a fair test. They marked off a quarter-acre test plot at the edge of the north field, soil that had been tested and confirmed as having the lowest calcium reading on the property. Half of that plot got a standard lime application. The other half got Emma's eggshell mixture, worked into the top few inches of soil with a garden tiller at roughly the equivalent rate per square foot. Then they planted a simple cover crop of clover across the whole test plot and waited. Cover crops like clover are useful for this kind of comparison Because clover is a legume, it fixes atmospheric nitrogen through a partnership with soil bacteria, but it's also sensitive to soil pH and calcium availability. Poor calcium levels show up quickly in stunted clover growth, pale coloring, and weak root nodulation. Emma checked the plot most days after school. She kept a small notebook, not because anyone assigned her homework about it, but because she wanted proof, one way or another. By early October, the difference was visible without needing a soil probe. The lime-treated half of the plot had thick, deep green clover, dense enough that you could barely see bare dirt between plants. The eggshell half was greener and denser than the untreated soil around it had ever been, but noticeably less vigorous than the limed section. When Walt pulled soil samples from both halves and sent them to the extension office for testing, the results matched what the clover had already shown. The lime section's pH had risen close to the target range. The eggshell section had improved too, measurably higher calcium availability than before treatment, but not as dramatically and not as fast. The explanation, once Walt looked into it with the county extension agent, made sense. Agricultural lime is ground to a very fine, consistent particle size, specifically so it dissolves efficiently in soil moisture. Home-crushed eggshells, even crushed by hand for months, are inconsistent. Some pieces fine as sand, some the size of a fingernail. The larger fragments break down far more slowly, sometimes taking years rather than months to fully release their calcium. For Emma, this could have felt like a disappointment. Instead, it turned into the most interesting part of the whole project. "So it works," she said, standing at the edge of the test plot with her grandfather, notebook in hand. "It just works slow. That's about the size of it," Walt told her. "Same ingredient your grandma buys from the store, more or less. Just needs to be ground up right to work fast." That distinction, that eggshells weren't a myth, but weren't a shortcut either, is exactly the kind of nuance that real agricultural science usually comes down to. It's rarely a flat yes or no. It's a matter of degree, rate, and practicality. The extension agent, when Walt described the experiment to her, said she'd seen a version of this question before, mostly from home gardeners rather than row crop farmers. Her answer matched what the test plot had shown. Eggshells are a legitimate, if slow, source of calcium carbonate for garden-scale use, particularly good for compost bins and raised beds. But they're not a practical substitute for lime at commercial field scale, simply because of the volume it would take and the grinding required to make them dissolve at a usable rate. For a 10-year-old running her own experiment, that was still a win. Her shells worked. Her chemistry was sound. She'd just discovered, firsthand, the difference between something being scientifically true and something being practically scalable, a distinction plenty of adults never get handed so clearly. What happened next is the part of this story that spread well past the Hensley Farm's property line. Emma's fourth-grade teacher had heard about the eggshell experiment from Emma's mother at a school function and asked Emma to bring her notebook in for show and tell. What was meant to be a 5-minute classroom presentation turned into something bigger when the teacher, impressed by how thorough the notebook was, dates, weather conditions, plot measurements, even her own hand-drawn chart comparing clover height between the two test sections, submitted it to the county's annual youth agriculture fair. Emma placed second in the junior soil science category, beaten only by a 7th grader's project on drainage tile spacing. But it was enough to get the local paper to run a short piece with a photo of Emma standing between her two clover plots, holding up a handful of crushed shell. That article is what eventually made its way to Walt's neighbors, then to a regional farm radio program, then, as these things sometimes do, into wider conversation among people who follow small farm and homestead stories online. What resonated with people wasn't really the eggshells themselves. Composting eggshells is not a new idea. Gardeners have done it for generations. What resonated was the process. A kid who heard her family talk about a real financial and agricultural problem, formed her own hypothesis, and then tested it honestly enough to accept an answer that wasn't a simple triumph. She didn't prove the lime was unnecessary. She proved something more useful, that an old, half-forgotten kitchen habit had real scientific merit, even if it wasn't a full replacement for the modern solution. The Hensley Farm still buys agricultural lime for its larger fields. That part hasn't changed. And Walt will tell you plainly there was never a version of this where 40 pounds of eggshell was going to outperform a properly calculated lime application across dozens of acres. But something else did change. The 5-gallon bucket at the diner in town is still filled every week. Emma's grandmother now keeps a dedicated container on the counter instead of tossing shells in with the regular kitchen scraps. And the vegetable garden behind the farmhouse, the one that feeds the family through summer and into fall, now gets a steady addition of crushed shell mixed into the compost pile before it ever reaches the tomatoes and squash. It turns out that scale matters. What doesn't work at 40 acres works quite well at 40 square feet. Garden soil, unlike a row crop field, is worked by hand, amended slowly over years, and doesn't need calcium correction to happen inside a single growing season. In that setting, Emma's method wasn't just a curiosity, it was genuinely useful, sustainable, and free. Walt has since started saving his own shells too, more out of habit now than experiment. Emma checks in on the compost pile the way she once checked her test plot, a quick look most days after school, sometimes jotting something down in a newer notebook that's replaced the one she used for the fair. She hasn't stopped asking questions either. Lately, she's been curious about whether crushed shells might help with something else Walt mentioned in passing, a mineral deficiency showing up in a few of the laying hens themselves, something about eggshell thinness in older birds, which is its own strange kind of full circle. Eggshells, once used to try to fix the soil, might end up helping explain a problem in the very hens that produce them. Walt hasn't discouraged her from looking into it. If there's one thing this farm has learned over 3 generations, it's that the questions worth asking rarely arrive with a tidy answer. They arrive slow, like calcium moving through soil, measurable, real, and worth the wait. That's the story of a 10-year-old, a coffee can full of eggshells, and a 1/4 acre of clover that quietly settled an argument at the Hensley family dinner table. Not with a miracle, with a fair test, an honest result, and a girl who was willing to accept an answer more complicated than the one she started out looking for.